Hi folks, as I promised in the forum in the response to a posting from Matthias, here's a follow-up to the previous episode where I made this bold statement that large networks with lots of unqualified users bringing their own devices is a worst-case scenario. And that using tools like ramond or the router advertisement monitoring daemon or RADAR guard, router advertisement guard or DHCP guard are extremely helpful to keep these networks up and running. And Matthias pointed out that this is not necessarily a kind of a worst case scenario, because there are people doing things they shouldn't do because they don't know any better. But there are actually situations where there are networks which are under serious attack by intentional malicious users or intruders, and that this is much worse. Well, okay, that's the point of view, right? However, there's a difference between those malicious attackers, generally speaking, and those hordes of dumb users who don't know what they're doing except how to break things in new and inventive ways. The difference is those dumb users always come in hordes, and that makes it troublesome. And if you're running that sort of network, you're supposed to deal with every single one of them and have to protect your network and no excuses. Whereas if you have a serious attack, you can say, well, okay, but if it's the MAF or some sort of so-called intelligence, whatever, foreign country stuff, what could I, as a poor little system network administrator, possibly do against them? Okay, well, two different point of views, right? And I agree with both of them in whatever situation. However, there is a reason why I consider, especially those conference venue networks or lecture hall networks and such, a worst case, and I actually mean it. And that's this one. If you take security serious, which you should in our job, IPv6 gives you two tremendously useful tools to deal with these situations in a lot of cases, which are no broadcasts, but working multicast routing instead, and plenty of addresses. So whereas with IPv4 we're sometimes forced to stuff different machines with different privileges and whatever into the same network, with the IPv6 in a lot of cases we can actually split these things up. Basically make sure that whatever attacker we might eventually have to deal with, be it incompetent or intentional, into their own subnet where they can only do damage, well, basically to themselves. And that's pretty cool about IPv6. It introduces a number of fun, I'm not going to say challenges here because people use that word for something that it doesn't mean, but things to take into consideration when you do an IPv6 deployment. But in many cases you can get a level of security that's pretty much impossible to achieve with the IPv4 and with large scale subnets. And the networks where you can't do that, like one of my favorites, conference venue, there you have a problem because you can't do it. If it's Wi-Fi, and Wi-Fi introduces a whole number of additional problems, and you have a large subnet with many machines in there, then you have a kind of a worst case, and I mean it. So you have a large network, lots of machines that you don't control, and some of them controlled by a malicious attacker. That's basically a worst case, combining these two things, and there's pretty much reason to look for a new job. And if you want to deal with problems in a more reasonable way, separating things into different subnets is the best thing you can do. There are people who are putting a lot of effort into maintaining, let's say, some level of security even in those large networks with potentially malicious attackers. There are the people who come up with SEND, Secure Neighbor Discovery, which I consider rather a lot of trouble for fairly limited use, and here's why. First of all, as soon as you introduce crypto, you introduce the risk or increase the risk of denial of service attacks. Basically, anytime you use crypto, an attacker will just throw some garbage at you, tell you, okay, start to decrypt this please, and you're much more vulnerable to denial of service attacks than without crypto. Same applies to web servers. It's much easier to bring down an HTTPS server doing denial of service attack than an HTTP server. And the other problem I have with SEND is it uses the interface ID as a cryptographic hash. Now the interface ID is 64 bits long, and cryptographic hash functions these days usually have, what, 160 bits upwards. So it might kind of work today, but if you think ahead for the next, what, maybe 20 years, this approach doesn't seem really, well, it might be worth the hassle in the short run, but I don't expect it to provide any reasonable protection in the long run, and you shouldn't really rely on that. And the other approach, or the other people who are dealing with these things, there are a couple of people who take or put much effort into improving the security of neighbor discovery. And neighbor discovery as such is designed in such a way that it assumes that all the machines within the network trust each other to the point that they, well, establish connections between each other, kind of. So there is basically the equivalent of ARP spoofing we have with IPv4, which is called, well, neighbor discovery spoofing, if you like. And we have a number of additional problems with the way neighbor discovery works. We also have at least one problem with at least some, I think, Cisco routers. Couldn't reproduce this with my little one, but that's probably because it's doing more stuff in software than the big iron machines, which can be exploited remotely in certain cases. There are ways to protect against that, but that involves a bit of work. And no, I'm not going to give you the details, because otherwise some of you might get some funny ideas or something. The people involved there's Mark Häuser here in Germany, in Berlin, and there's Fernando Gont. Those are probably the two most active ones. Fernando is from Buenos Aires, which, as you all know from geography classes, is the capital of Brazil, not Brussels, because Brussels, after all, is the capital of Holland, right? And what they're doing is trying to improve the security of neighbor discovery in a number of ways. And when I first heard about these things, I thought, okay, this is a lost cause, really. And I still, to some degree, think it is. Why is that? Because the entire TCP/IP world always assumes a certain level of cooperation, at least within a subnet, where machines are closely together, and traditionally they were considered to be in the same administrative domain, sort of thing. So some rather crude attacks simply shouldn't happen. However, they do happen. And as soon as you provide an attacker a chance to get into the same subnet as a potential target, you have a huge problem. the only way to deal with these problems properly, and that doesn't work in all cases, is to split them into separate subnets. And if you don't believe this, I can explain why. An attacker will always try to use the most convenient way of attack. So if Fernando and Mark did a hell of a lot of work to secure neighbor discovery, well, if I was an attacker, what I'd do? Well, something like this. Come up with this, for example. And what's that? Okay, there's an RJ45 connector. You plug in a twisted pair port, and this is a Germany style mains connector. In theory, network hardware should actually be able to handle those, about 400 volts peak that you get out of these, but I wouldn't bet the life of my network hardware on that. Definitely not. Oh, and of course, they're also coming slightly dusty, but anyway, RG58 BNC style thinnet. And the reason why I actually keep these here on my wall is to remind me that no matter how much effort you put into fixing a certain area, like a single network layer, attackers will go around that. You get the same problem with Wi-Fi. You just use a jamming transmitter if you want. Even worse with Zigbee and IEEE 82.15.4, like 6LoWPAN networks, where the devices heavily depend on being able to turn off their transmitters, receivers, whatnot. And a single node in a subnet or a cell or whatever misbehaving will actually keep all the other nodes busy all the time and just drain their batteries, or run them out of power if they are, for example, solar cell powered or whatever. So dealing with security at the network layer only gets you so far. That said, I think what Mark and Fernando are doing is very important, because after all, there are these worst cases, and any sort of help people running those can get is really worth it. But you should keep in mind that if you want to sort these problems out, just split up your networks, because IPv6 has a number of very nice features concerning protection from attacks across router boundaries or across routers. There's, things like ICMP redirects, which can't be injected from outside any longer, and that sort of stuff. So that's really nice, aside from having packet filters involved to clean up things as well. So that's pretty good. Oh, and another thing about especially some of the publications I've read from Mark, things I've read in German EX, I think, a German IT magazine, professional IT magazine, his assessments of security problems with the IPv6 are perfectly correct and reasonable. However, what apparently gets frequently edited out half the time is the part or the sentence that with IPv4, however, it's all much worse, because that's basically the situation we have there. And that gets dropped because everybody knows about the problems with IPv4, and well, there's nothing new about it, so the news people tend to drop these things, but it sort of distorts the perception for people who are new to IPv6. So you want to be a bit aware of that. And if you read some rather spectacular news story or security problem with IPv6, well, maybe first try to figure out what the equivalent problem with IPv4 is, because pretty much all the time it's worse over there. Possibly with one exception, which has to do that you have so many addresses in a subnet that attackers might actually make use of these even from the outside by running some routers or whatever out of memory. But if you want to know more about that, I'm sure if you Google for Mark or Fernando, you'll find lots of references for the work in more detail. Okay, so much as a follow-up on the previous episode, and why I consider large networks kind of a worst case scenario, even with dumb users only. And if you want to discuss more on this, come over to the forum at www.stepladder-it.com/24. If you like this and watch this on YouTube, please do me a favor and give it a thumbs up. Makes things helps to get things more widely known. And in any case, hopefully see you again, well, soon, but not that soon, because next week I'll be at the RIDE meeting in Warsaw and probably not gonna be able to have another episode done before then. Okay, so long, bye.